to get an absolute value, but that's deceptive. A typical American working family at that time probably made about $500 a year, from which they paid their housing and food and everything else. It's not just the absolute value, it's that prices, some things were a lot more expensive than today, and other things were a lot cheaper. So there are kind of different ways in which it worked. But $27 was a lot of money. It would take a long time to save up. So they returned to the land and they began to prosper, and 3 children were born, and they built a comfortable house, homely on the outside, but plastered and cozy inside. But their luck broke when Hattie died in childbirth along with her 4th child. Heartbroken, Milton buried his wife and child and abandoned his farm once and for all. He tried farming in 4 locations before he died in 1905 while trying to start a farm in Saskatchewan in Canada. In the mid-1880s, Rasmus and Ona Ebbesen and their 8-year-old son Peter arrived from Denmark to live in Kansas City, where they found jobs that would allow them to accumulate the savings they needed to begin farming. Rasmus dug ditches for the railroad, and Ona worked as a cleaning woman. Peter went to work as well, delivering water to construction workers. After saving up money, they moved west into Kansas, just into the eastern portion of Kansas, close to Kansas City. After saving up, the Ebbesens suffered through an epic grasshopper infestation, much like the Leapers, but stayed on their land. Over the years, their holdings expanded to 160 acres, and they replaced their original simple house with a 2-story or more ornate home, paid for with the money that Peter earned as a school teacher. When they were wiped out by a violent hailstorm, they accepted the offer of a local banker to buy them out. They did not feel that they got fair value for their land, but they used the money to return to Kansas City and buy a modest house. And in any event, Peter was a school teacher and then became a school administrator in Kansas City. So 2 contrasting stories, one of relative failure and one of relative success, but it's hard to say that it was just the market that generated success and failure. Now, I want to talk about the Henry Adams family, who were former slaves from Mississippi who were part of the Exoduster, what's called the Exoduster Exodus, I guess would be the best way to say. And at the end of Reconstruction, as white supremacy took hold of the South, particularly in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, thousands of freed slaves decided that they no longer wanted to live in the South. And they decided that they would move to the Great Plains and homestead, find land that they could squat on. The newly formed white supremacist governments in the South tried to stop this exodus, but it was too big for them to be able to do so. And people arrived in Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and even points further west, lining up on the banks of the Mississippi River and the Missouri River to take steamboats. So the Adams family arrived in Kansas, just west of Kansas City. They built a modest but nice home, and we have a photograph of them here. They lived in an all-black town of black farmers, and they went through this whole period with relative ease, without any great crisis. Why? They weren't able to get loans. It was difficult for them to sell their produce to the commodities dealers. As blacks in a racist society, they were excluded from the market. So they were spared a lot of the ups and downs of the market. They lived poorly, but reasonably comfortably. So, these are three of the stories that I can tell you about farmers who tried to take advantage of the opening up of the Great Plains. Natural disasters and suddenly taking ill and dying, these were all normal events in 19th century America, as they had been in most communities, probably all communities, for millennia. The loose organization, the fluctuation of the economy, a greater sense that order was needed if the country was to fulfill its potential, was taking hold amongst many people. A conviction that there was too much unpredictability, too much laissez-faire, that the country and the people in it could not address the challenges, either natural or social, that confronted them. Now, in Iowa, just to the north of Kansas City, 1 out of 3 farmers abandoned their property between 1885 and 1890, just walked away, defaulting on the loans that they had received so they could buy their land and plant their crops. 1 out of 3 farmers just abandoned their property. Families just packed up and moved on, partly because there was no point in continuing to make their payments, but also they could move 2 or 3 counties further west. Nobody knew who they were. They'd get another loan, and they'd start all over again. There was no credit union. There was no way of checking up on your record. You could keep on participating in the speculative fever because relationships were largely local. The banks or the county governments took possession of abandoned properties and they auctioned them off. And if you were lucky, the price would be low enough that you could pay cash, and all you would have to worry about were your property taxes, which you might want to keep low, even if it meant that you didn't have good roads or schools or public health programs. But if you needed to get a loan, generally you could. Banks did not worry about down payments, having so much property on their hands already. Mortgage payments were high, in part because of the high rate of defaults, and bankers would make their money as best they could. Farmers went deeper and deeper into debt, and eventually many of them simply gave up. For the average farmer in the 1880s, security was non-existent. For the bankers, a high rate of loan defaults and a constant turnover of land was not necessarily such a bad thing. There always seemed to be another family ready to try its luck. Let's see. Not all farmers suffered. Defaulted properties might be snapped up by the more successful who built very, very large land empires. Now, here in California, the San Francisco meatpackers, Henry Miller and Charles Lux, built up the single largest farming operation in the United States. They owned 421,000 acres in California's Central Valley, and their properties extended from Sacramento south 250 miles. At their peak, they owned 100,000 head of cattle, spread over 1.25 million acres in 3 states. In 1900, they were the only agricultural corporation to be ranked in the top 200 industrial enterprises of the country. They engineered massive water projects that transformed the Central Valley, largely draining off the once extensive marshlands. And these are pictures that were taken for the Miller-Lux empire, which are taken in order to demonstrate that this is no longer family farming. This is scientific capitalism, managerial capitalism applied to land and the production of agricultural commodities. We're no longer talking about food, we're talking about agricultural commodities. Miller-Lux kept a tight control over the labor market. Initially, they relied on Mexican labor, which was the most skilled in Western cattle ranching. Then Mexican workers demanded more money, and as they were working to acquire their own land, and then the company dismissed most of their Mexican employees and imported in Italians who were willing to work for less money. As the Italian employees started acquiring property and wanted more money to support their economic advancement, the firm contracted to import Japanese and Armenian workers. Then, when Japanese and Armenian workers organized and wanted more money, the firm dismissed them all and imported in 6 from the Indian Empire, the British Indian Empire, from South Asia. So there was the sequence of what might appear to be random ethnic immigrations into California, but in fact they weren't random at all. This was the Miller-Lux sequence of waves of new workers, all of whom were ethnically identified, reflects an aspect of the labor market that we're going to consider in greater depth next week and subsequently. Large employers preferred to hire en masse through a labor contractor or through the head of a family. This created a buffer between them and their individual employees. By reducing contact and connection, the employers reduced personal interaction and the mutual responsibility for each other's welfare that was expected. So, partly you would go and contract with a senior figure in the Italian community who would then deliver to you however many workers you thought you needed, many of whom would be family relatives. And so the labor market was racially, ethnically segmented. A breakdown in personal connection and mutuality was experienced, or at least commented upon in the newspapers, in diaries, and in letters, as a breakdown in moral standards. Boyd Smith saw the world around him as one in moral decline. A person could not trust the people